Okay. Well, thanks everybody so much for coming. This is a lecture that is about organized violence, mostly in the developing world, and I'm going to be discussing two major types of organized violence: civil war, also called intrastate war, as well as terrorism. So, this lecture does a couple of things, or at least it aims to do a couple of things. First thing is that I want to share with you some of the major cutting-edge findings on what causes civil war and how civil war dynamics and terrorism play out. I also, in some ways, kind of want to make a pitch to you that in the activity right now, we spend a lot of time focusing on how to prevent wars between states, and I want to suggest to you that that is kind of, in some ways, a misplaced concern, given the trends of warfare since 1945. And so I want to try to sell you on the idea that it is really worth our time to have lots and lots of debates about organized violence in the developing world, particularly about how to mitigate the effects of or end civil wars. And I want to show you that civil war is, in terms of organized violence, probably the biggest scourge on humanity of the last century. So, on that happy note, ready? Here we go. So, as we know, debates about the magnitude of war between states is really, really common. And that makes sense in all of our impact scenarios. We have a competitive incentive to debate about interstate war, particularly war between great powers, especially powers that possess nuclear weapons, because how else are you going to get an extinction impact, right? And so there is a strong competitive incentive to focus on preventing interstate war. I think there is also, because of the way that civil war is talked about in a lot of media, a sort of disincentive for us to discuss civil war because there isn't very much high-quality, sustained media focus on it. Gradually, that is changing as civil wars proliferate, so Syria, Yemen, Libya. But for a long time, I think that this has been true, and it makes sense that that would be true because, first of all, it's very hard to get information on the ground when civil wars are ongoing. And also, I don't know if any of you have ever just sat down on a Wikipedia page about, say, like the Second Congolese Civil War. It is so confusing. There are so many different actors, and they're constantly switching sides. There is actually a logic to side switching and fractionalization among rebel groups and insurgent organizations and terrorist actors that I'll hopefully have some time to talk about. And it also makes sense because the immediate geopolitical importance of, say, insurgency in Mali is not really obvious. So, although it is understandable, I want to suggest that our activity's emphasis on preventing interstate war, not that interstate war is good, is a little bit odd given empirical trends in global war. So for example, interstate war has become a comparatively rare phenomenon since 1945. The end of World War II heralded a period of much less interstate war, war between states, and a proliferation of civil wars. Ann Hironaka wrote an excellent book called Never-Ending Wars that is about this phenomenon. Estimates that there are only about 25% as many interstate wars now as there were in 1840. So gradually, wars between states declines. And there are a bunch of explanations. Why do you think war between states might have declined during this period? Nuclear weapons. It's a very good one. So mutually assured destruction. Strong disincentive to start interstate wars. Yeah. Yeah, that's another very good one. Growth of international institutions that facilitate trade and communication, so globalization, yes?
Rebuilding periods in the sorts of countries that could sustain long interstate wars.
Yeah, that's another very, very good one. A lot of the European states that had developed really credible coercive mechanisms, really awesome militaries, were destroyed at the end of World War II. So that's another very good one. So lots of factors have caused a decrease in interstate war. So there's also strong international norms against wars of territorial expansion or conquest. That is a norm that has proliferated a lot since 1945. And in the second half of the 20th century, there were 25 interstate wars, 3.33 million battle deaths, median duration about 3 months, which, while that's terrible, if you think about it, is not actually that long. This data is a little bit old. It's from kind of groundbreaking article by James Fearon and David Layton at Stanford, but I'll have a little bit of data that's a little bit more recent, but it's hard to collect data on battle deaths in civil wars. There's a time lag for fairly obvious reasons. So that's the decline of interstate war, but civil war has become very common since 1945. 125 civil wars in the second half of the 20th century, as opposed to 25 interstate wars. 16.2 million battle deaths. That's just battle deaths. Median duration of 6 years. So that does not include deaths that are accidental, deaths from disease spread, deaths that result in like starvation from the destruction of infrastructure. And the rate of outbreak, about 2.3 a year, concluding only about 1.85 a year. So there are progressively more civil wars as time goes on. And it is true, of course, that sometimes wars start as interstate conflicts, right? U.S. and Afghanistan, U.S. and Iraq, but those very quickly become intrastate conflicts. And there's a graphical representation. There's battle deaths in millions. Sure.
Are we, is this like show can also be on Dropbox?
Yeah, sure. All right. So there's battle deaths in millions. Civil war, interstate war. And the frequency, civil war, interstate war. Duration, civil war, interstate war. Have I made this point is clear? Good. So, question then. Why should we focus on debating about how to end contemporary civil wars? If you add up those number of battle deaths, that's the number of people that are currently living in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston. And if you were to include Yemen, Syria, and Libya, that would surely be another major American city that would be wiped out. Just think about every person living in those cities just gone. That is the human toll of civil war in battle deaths alone. They last longer than interstate wars, they're more common, and they obliterate social and economic opportunities later. Paul Collier, who's a very famous economist who writes a lot about the effect of civil war, says the average cost of a civil war, just in terms of infrastructure damage and lost productivity, is $64 billion. So they are costly, not only in terms of blood, but also in terms of treasure. And of course, what argument about focusing on civil wars would be complete? Failed states become vectors for international terrorism and disease spread, and that affects everybody. And also, it's appropriate for people debating in the United States to talk about how to end contemporary civil wars because U.S. foreign policy has been part of the problem in exacerbating them. Cold War interventions, the United States and the Soviet Union very frequently armed both rebel groups and very unseemly states in proxy wars. A recent interesting trend is that parity, in battlefield parity in terms of capabilities, between rebel groups and states has actually started to even out in the absence of Cold War funding. So rebel groups and states are achieving parity when they're not getting as much funding from outside sources like Russia and the United States. That's an article by a guy named Stathis Kalidas that makes that argument. All right. So now, I think I've made this case. So I want to talk a little bit about the factors that make states vulnerable to civil wars. Because here is the problem. There is a lot of conventional wisdom about the outbreak of civil war, and often that conventional wisdom is wrong. What would you guess makes a state vulnerable to civil war?
The state doesn't have the actual power to exert authority over its whole population, or it has incomplete authority, and therefore uses violent measures to kind of check on it like an authoritarian regime.
Right. So, state weakness, very common to virtually all civil wars. State weakness, or in extreme cases like Somalia, state failure. So states that don't command the monopoly on violence. It means that different armed non-state factions are able to control territory. And also are able to, over the long term, engage the incumbent, the state, in sustained military combat. What else? Yeah?
Religious differences?
Not quite. Yeah?
Ethnic differences and conflicts?
This is very common. Which is to say that this is the kind of conventional wisdom, but it's actually not empirically true. Pretty much all of the cross-national quantitative findings on civil war say that actually ethno-linguistic fractionalization and religious fractionalization do not cause civil war. They're not even positively correlated with civil war. It seems like there's a ton of anecdotal evidence that would suggest that it is, but it's actually not. You would think, because it's intuitive, as the number of religious groups increases within a state, or as the number of ethnic groups increases with the state, that should increase the number of conflict dyads and increase the probability that those states would go to civil war. But that's actually not empirically accurate. Yeah.
Look at the U.S. for example. We probably have more religious diversity than any other country, like, and we're not necessarily
Well,
obviously.
there's some diversity in the United States, sure, but no weak state. Yeah,
that's
Brent.
cool,
They go bankrupt. Or they effectively can't pay for things. They go
The
bankrupt.
states?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, poor economic performance, low GDP per capita. That is usually a signal that the state is weak, but it's also usually a marker of widespread poverty. Here is why that's important. Widespread poverty means that the opportunity cost to joining a rebellion is lower, right? People make rational decisions about whether or not to fight because you can die or get maimed or have to do some really awful things to other people when you join an insurgency. And so, if you're making a fair amount of money, you're probably content with the status quo. You are much less likely to join a rebel group, at least theoretically. Collier Hoffler make that argument. Jeremy Weinstein is a guy at Stanford who wrote an excellent book on the political economy of rebellion. It's called Inside Rebellion, that I would strongly recommend. So, low opportunity cost. Yeah?
Isn't one like natural resource-based economy some sort of situation?
That's another fairly common one. There is a lot of debate and back and forth in the literature about whether or not economies that are heavily dependent on natural resource extraction are more prone to civil war. It makes a lot of intuitive sense, but there are so many problems with the data that is used that there's I don't list it, but that's a fairly common argument. The other one is rough terrain, which is one of those things that's just so obvious you don't even think about it. That it's easier to launch an insurgency from the mountains or in the forest than it is in a really well-developed state with lots of infrastructure. It's easier to hide and evade capture.
Couldn't that be correlational though? As in like
It is correlational.
I mean like with the area countries that have more modernization and more industrialization, they have these advantages because they didn't have to deal with rough terrain.
Mm-hmm. Or yeah. So that's a pretty good insight. That rough terrain or the availability of wide tracts of rough terrain may be correlated with low GDP per capita and state weakness, so maybe shouldn't be considered its own empirical. So yeah, that's a good point. But rough terrain usually found in the cross-national studies of civil war that make a state vulnerable. All right, next. What does not put a country at risk for civil war? Ethnic heterogeneity and broad-based grievance. So a very common narrative in case studies of civil war, that the state was just oppressive and corrupt, and so some freedom fighters decided to get together and overthrow the state. So I want to suggest to you that broad grievance is not sufficient. In fact, it's not even necessary for a state to descend into civil war. Fearon and Leighton make the argument that the only thing you really need to launch a civil war if you are living in a weak state, 5,000 dudes, 5,000 AKs, and 2 satellite phones. Because if you think about it, if you're recruiting from populations that don't have very much money, so the opportunity cost of fighting is low, you only need to recruit among that population and get out into the rough terrain, and you'll be able to launch an effective insurgency if the state is sufficiently weak. That is not to say that rebel groups don't, in many instances, have legitimately held grievances or ideological differences with the state. They do, but it is not a necessary condition. Does that make sense? Okay. So the important point is that state weakness creates the conditions for civil wars. Strong states that have a monopoly on violence usually don't fight civil wars. Okay. Yes?
Is another factor of civil war, like how's the correlation between prevalent black markets like drug trade and animal trade?
Oh, that's a great question. So, to my knowledge, there's not a lot of work that would say that there is a causal relationship between the existence of a black market and then civil war, but rather the two are often found together. Part of the reason, obviously, would be state weakness, but also there is a really interesting finding that lots of rebel groups that survive for a long time enter black markets eventually as a way to finance themselves. So there is actually a fair amount of overlap between organizations that launch insurgencies and organizations that fund themselves eventually through things like the drug trade or natural resource exploitation. All right. So where did all these weak states come from? Because there are a lot of them. That's why there's so much civil war. Colonialism. Colonization of Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. The colonial state, there are really two causal pathways that I think are helpful in explaining why colonization and subsequent decolonization allowed for the conditions for proliferation of civil war. So there were some instances where the colonial state engaged in just such incredible resource plundering and murder that the economic foundations after decolonization were already pretty much shot. So, for example, the Congo Free State is perhaps a historical entity that you may have heard of. It was basically a private state that was run by King Leopold of Belgium, and it had a very brutal and extractive rubber industry that decimated the economy and local economies in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that is one pathway. But the other, and I think you may have heard Corey talking about this, for those of you who were just in his lecture, lots of colonial states were actually very weak. There's a lot of variation in how strong, in terms of their empirical presence, colonial states were. Some were crushing, like the Congo Free State. Others had really weak infrastructures. And it makes sense that they would have weak infrastructures because you don't want the colonial states themselves, the bureaucracies, to be strong because then they'll organize. And as a colonizer, that's not in your interest. And so that's why so many colonial states that became sovereign states were basically born into the world with a very weak infrastructure and quickly descended into civil war. Now, European states had centuries and centuries to build excellent militaries and effective bureaucracies. Decolonized states had considerably less time to do so because Europe spent so much of its formative history fighting. Also, Hironaka, number of states that were former colonies quadrupled after 1945, all helping to explain the prevalence of weak states, the prevalence of civil war. Good? All right. So why do weak states persist? Because, as a couple of us talked about this morning, the realists, especially the neo-realists, the dominant ones, make the argument that states have to fight each other and seek self-help so that eventually the strongest states emerge, which is definitely what happened in Europe. But why has that not happened in the contemporary world? Well, it's because the international community protects weak states. There has been a proliferation of this very strong norm against territorial expansion, so wars of territorial expansion. So theoretically, the strongest African states should have already taken over a ton of other very weak African states if the world were truly anarchic. Does that make sense? That would be the tenet of realism. But the international community protects those weak states. They protect the legal right to existence regardless of empirical presence. For example, Somalia does not make sense to speak of Somalia as a state. It has no empirical presence as a state, but it is still a member of the United Nations and still has lots of sovereign legal privileges. Somaliland makes way more sense to talk about as a state, but there's a strong norm in the international community to not recognize substates, even if they are empirically much stronger than the, in some instances, almost fictional legal state. Also, significant flows of international aid to weak and failing states, which would have collapsed without it, which, as Collier points out, often weirdly doesn't reach civilians, but rather gets diverted into patronage networks. And so, if you're getting tons of money, and the international community is likely to protect your sovereign legal right to exist, What incentive do you have as a weak state ruler to make your state stronger? You have a much diminished incentive than if the world were truly anarchic. All right, so we take a breather from civil war and we go to terrorism. Okay, so generally speaking, terrorism is a battle tactic. It happens when a non-state organization commits violence, usually against civilians, in order to get a message to a target audience, which is usually state elites. Now, 1,500 dead in acts of terrorism since 2011, if you're not including people who live in battle zones, right? So compared to the death toll of civil wars, fairly low, but think about the US expenditures on counterterrorism since 2001 for a form of violence that, relatively speaking, does not kill that many people. Over $1 trillion, not counting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A tremendous expenditure for a type of organized violence that, comparatively speaking, doesn't harm as many people. Not to diminish the impact of terrorism. Now, here is the thing though. There is a ton of conventional wisdom about terrorism, and a lot of it is wrong. So, for example, who do you think gets recruited to join terrorist organizations, like, say, Al-Qaeda?
Actually, well-educated
Yes.
professionals.
That's right. But the common narrative is that people who join these transnational terrorist networks are irrational and religiously deluded and not particularly well-educated. But that's not really the case with terrorist recruitment, for Al-Qaeda especially. Al-Qaeda really prefers to only take applicants that are pretty well-educated and highly qualified. Why do you think that would be?
So they don't get caught.
What's that?
So they don't get caught.
Yeah, so that they don't get caught and so that operations go according to plan. Terrorist organizations operate much more like private firms than conventional wisdom would suggest. It's not a bunch of irrationally violent people running around blowing things up for no reason. Even though coverage of terrorism makes it seem like it's chaotic and senseless, there's a very distinct logic to recruitment and to the execution of terrorist violence. So, it's interesting. The people who are most likely to join organizations like Al-Qaeda, fairly well educated, and actually fairly well off. But they're well off relative to their peers in states that are poor. So what that means is that they're fairly well educated, their families might do okay, but their probability of, mobility, like upward mobility in their state is pretty low, which means that even though they're well educated, their opportunity cost of fighting is lower. And some will have legitimately held ideological proclivities or beliefs that make them more likely to join Al-Qaeda. And so, oh, by the way, in case anybody's interested, an excellent article about how Al-Qaeda recruits is called The Quality of Terror in the American Journal of Political Science by a guy named Ethan Bueno de Mesquita. In it, he analyzes a discovered Al-Qaeda training manual, as well as an uncovered document that explains how recruiters are supposed to interview applicants. Because if you're doing a very high-risk job like Al-Qaeda, you only want the best people. You want to screen out the low-commitment or low-quality applicants who are, likely to blow themselves up in the wrong place. So, sorry? Oh, it's called The Quality of Terror by Ethan Bueno de Mesquita. Now, Danielle Jung and a couple of her co-authors have an article in Terrorism and Political Violence that is fairly recent that's about organizational structures within terrorism, and basically makes the argument that there are vertical organizations, so strong sense of hierarchy, and then there are looser networks, horizontally based organizations. And they have this really interesting finding that the vertically integrated organizations kill more people per attack than the horizontal organizations, but not necessarily more people in aggregate. Suicide terrorism. This is the tactic that probably gets the most coverage as an irrational act that is chaotic and senseless and done only by crazy people, because who would blow themselves up? Or done only by religious fanatics because they think they're going to get 72 virgins in heaven, right? Remember that after 9/11, the very common narrative about suicide attacks. Well, Robert Pate writes an excellent article on suicide terrorism that basically calls out a lot of these assumptions. So think about why suicide terrorism would be a good battle tactic. Pape says it's good because it's a very credible, it is in fact probably the most credible signal of resolve against a state, right? Because it takes away the major threat that a state has against you, which is to kill you. The Freedom Birds were a group of female suicide bombers with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE, or the Tamil Tigers from Sri Lanka. Common misconception is that suicide bombing originated in the Middle East. It was the LTTE that pioneered the suicide belt. The LTTE was very long-lasting, very creative, and for a long time, very successful terrorist organization. So the Freedom Birds were female suicide bombers. In 2006, a pregnant female suicide bomber with the LTTE blew herself up in front of an administrative building in Colombo, the capital, which, again, a credible signal of resolve. Like we talked about, in some instances, there may be a fairly low opportunity cost for the people who get recruited to become suicide bombers. Also, there is a financial incentive. Many organizations offer lots of money for the rest of a suicide bomber family's life. So the family is not doing well, has limited opportunity for upward mobility. Terrorist organizations will sometimes offer high rewards for family members. That varies by terrorist organization, but that is one reason. Yeah.
I think that's where you get the stereotype of like uneducated terrorists that, you know, the fanatics and stuff, is because what they really are seeing are the over-sensationalized like suicide bombers, and then like why they're actually doing this stuff. But yeah, it's like the payment for
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And Pape also comes to a pretty fascinating conclusion that, you know, maybe lots of people don't want to hear, so it's probably true, that suicide terrorism is very effective, particularly against democracies. Particularly against democracies, which makes sense, because autocratic governments that don't have credible linkages to civil society, if you're running around blowing civilians up in an autocratic country, it doesn't necessarily mean that the state, the autocrat, the elites, are going to care as much as they would in a democracy, because there are more binding, credible linkages between a democratic government and civil society. It also means that the people who are most at risk for going to the market and getting blown up can exert way more pressure on a democratic state to negotiate with the terrorists, which is why suicide terrorism empirically results in concessions that the terrorist group wants. Yeah?
Can it be effective in terms of just attracting the attention of the target audience, or achieving the goals?
This is actually about achieving the particular goals, but it also makes a ton of sense that if the rest of this is true, it would be very good in attracting attention.
What goals in particular are they effective for? What are the levers?
Oh, it varies greatly. So, Pape talks for a while about the Tamil Tigers and a couple of other organizations like in Lebanon that had basically territorial grievances. So the Tigers are a really good example of an ethnic group, the Tamils, that were dominated by the Sinhalese, who ran Sri Lanka for a long time. And they wanted, the Tamil Tigers, their own Tamil homeland, at least an autonomous area, free of control from Colombo, the capital. And so it's fairly common for suicide terrorism to be committed in the context of territorial disputes. Yes?
I took a class on this. I was just gonna say, another thing possibly is we learned that suicide terror is great for recruitment,
Yep.
right? And so it's a lot of low opportunity cost for the terrorist organization to kind of coincide with that like signal of resolve.
Right.
That there are really good opportunities to show signal of resolve. So it's like one person commits suicide terror attack, would probably get like 50 people in. they were good for money. And then additionally we covered the gendered aspect of it. So the two things that we learned were that suicide terror was very effective in recruiting males, because a lot of the arguments that go out is that, look, women are committing suicide terror, and so they use that very masculine like discussion of that men should join because of this. And two, women are harder to track when it comes to money. So women were used a lot for funding after suicide terror, and so they would commit acts of suicide terror, and showing all this resolve, the organization would start to get an influx of money. But because the organization had recruited a lot more women, and women were allowed to become suicide terrorists, then they would use women's information instead of men to funnel money into the organization.
That's
It's,
really interesting.
Orbitals and Stodinger.
Sorry?
Orbital and Stodinger are the authors.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd definitely like to talk about that a little bit more. All right, so those are some insights into suicide terrorism. Now, we've got some time, which is the really important question, which is what is to be done, right? So we have established that intrastate war is a scourge and that terrorism is costing a massive amount of money in terms of CT operations, not just from the United States. So the question is, what does effective counterterrorism look like? What works in counterterrorism? What's the term? What's that?
Hearts and minds.
Hearts and minds. Yeah, Alex.
There's this one author, Cronin, who has like the 6 strategies of preventing it, right? I think decapitation, negotiation, entry into a legitimate political process, and then a couple other ones. So depending on what the terrorism looks like or what the goals are, you have to pick a different and like tailored response to it.
Yeah, exactly right. So, yeah, please.
Have you read Imperial Hubris?
No.
Well, he argues that the only way to end terrorism is we have to do it from the military front, but then you have to back it up with policy changes, or else it's just going to continue to be reborn.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, so thanks. That's all excellent and very good. So it depends in part on the strategies, in part on the organizational structure of the terrorist organizations, in part on the probability of credibly bringing these organizations into the fold. One fairly recent finding was that insurgent groups and terrorist groups, if they have a political wing attached to them, so they don't just fight, but they have their own administrative political wing, the civil war in which those groups fight is likely to be much shorter, which makes sense because it increases the probability of negotiation and communication between the terrorist organization, the insurgent organization, and the state of the economy. Now, here is another question. It's fairly common to suggest that, well, policies that promote economic growth will prevent terrorism. There is some support for that, but also it has to be highly contextualized because terrorism occurs even in well-developed states, right? Think of Ireland. So it is not necessarily widespread economic growth that is going to be the answer. Effective CT requires much more than that, as you all have pointed out. Okay. Now, question, particularly in relation to civil war, intrastate war, does international aid help or hurt? Unsurprisingly, the field isn't sure. So there is a lot of really interesting work that is getting produced now about what works in development that uses experimental data. 2 people at Columbia in particular, a guy named McCartan Humphreys and a guy named Chris Blattman, do really excellent experimental work on what types of aid and infrastructure problems work in like post-conflict Liberia and which ones don't seem to work very well. And sometimes they arrive at different conclusions. So just the international aid literature itself is massive. And contextualized to civil war, different perspectives on what, if anything, helps. Moyo, Dead Aid, very famous book, basically making the argument that international aid for Africa has unequivocally made the African political situation worse. Collier, in 2007, wrote an excellent book, The Bottom Billion, that has a slightly more nuanced interpretation. So those are 2 authors to check out if you're interested in the question of whether or not international aid is helpful. Now, related to the question of international aid, how not to give international aid. All right, warlordism. This is an interesting technique of political economy and civil war. And there are a couple of people that are writing really excellent books and articles about the political economy of warlordism in weak states and how international aid creates warlord regimes. So I want to briefly go over that now. So, warlordism, common feature. What is a warlord? The formal definition is that a warlord is somebody who uses coercive power, so military power, not necessarily the state's military power, but coercive power in order to control access to private markets, valuable goods, especially natural resources and transportation. Protection gets sold to private resource extraction companies by warlords very frequently. So for example, Kabila, who is currently the head of state in the Democratic Republic of Congo, made a lot of money with a rebel group offering protection services to multinational resource extraction companies that wanted to operate safely in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So these multinational corporations have struck deals with various unseemly rebel groups in order to safely operate in the areas that the rebel groups control. That was very, very common in Central and Southern Africa. That's also very common in Afghanistan. Fairly frequently, if you want to build a state or if you just want to make a lot of money for resource plundering, you have to work with warlords. Now, why is this important? McCormick and Fritz have a 2009 article that estimates that there are more functioning informal warlord regimes than there are member states of the United Nations, which is incredible if you think about it. There are tons and tons and tons of small little warlord states throughout the developing world. Who gets to be a warlord? So many will say rebel group leaders act as warlords. William Reno wrote a book in 1998 called Warlord Politics in African States that says that some formal heads of state basically behave like warlords. And I'll explain that in just a second. But as you can imagine, warlord-controlled areas and functioning informal warlord regimes, not democratic. Not democratic, don't create binding linkages with civil society, and operate only to enrich the elites within those informal structures. Which is why the proliferation of warlord regimes in the last 20 years is a major problem. So Reno explains how some weak state rulers basically became warlords. And it's a really fascinating finding because it sort of flips some of our assumptions about the nature of patronage and corruption in the developing world. The argument is this. So you're a ruler in a weak state. Okay? You don't have a lot of infrastructural power. You can't really command the monopoly on violence. But you have political rivals. What do? Ideally, what you do is you take all that aid money and whatever other money you're getting from natural resource extraction and distribute it in patronage networks to your rivals. Give your rivals posts in weak bureaucracies. Give them money. Give them access to natural resource capital, because that will keep the peace. Patronage was a way of keeping the peace. Yes, it's corrupt. Yes, it's not how an ideal market functions, but it kept the peace for a long time in some weak states, was Reno's argument. Well then, the 80s happened. Oh, the 80s. And with the 80s came the resurgence of neoliberalism. And this very common idea among economists and development strategists that creating strong states and free markets is what will allow for international development. And the only way to build a strong state and create free markets is to get rid of corruption and patronage. So often, when heads of weak states were starting to get money from the IMF and the World Bank in the 80s and onward, they came with conditions that said, you have to clean up your patronage networks, you have to trim these bloated bureaucracies that you have filled up with your well-paid rivals. So in order to get the aid money, the weak state rulers do that. But what happens?
The rivals become angry, they start violence.
Yes. The rivals get angry. They have no incentive to keep the peace anymore. They've been cut out of the patronage system. So the system that was keeping the peace for a long time is gone. Now, you have a bunch of angry rivals, and you can't buy them off. and you don't really have a functioning monopoly on violence. You don't have a very good military. Fortunately for you, there are companies that will help you. Private military corporations. Most amazingly, an organization called Executive Outcomes, which was listed on the Vancouver Stock Exchange. So you could actually buy and sell stock in the fate of civilian lives in Angola. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so private military corporations like Executive Outcomes sell their services to these weak heads of state. And the strategy is, I pay you, you clear these valuable natural resource-rich areas of my rivals. And then I extract the natural resources and take the profits. Does that make sense? So that was the strategy of warlordism. And Reno says that this became a really common strategy in Liberia, Sierra Leone, as well as Angola. Executive Outcomes, to my understanding, has actually fought on both sides of the Angolan Civil War. And a lot of them were actually ex-South African military people. So they certainly had the skills to fight, decent counterinsurgency. So that is the political economy of warlords. And warlords then can either, clear their rivals or they fail and they're killed. One very famous warlord, Charles Taylor of Liberia, ran his own informal warlord regime called Taylorland. And he sold his protection services to companies like Firestone. So he also had rubber. So that's warlordism. All right, one last set of things to talk about. Counterinsurgency, role of civilians. Fairly standard reading states, rebel groups often have to compete over civilians, which makes sense because civilians can be sources of logistical or financial support, they are potential recruits, or they're real or imagined sources of legitimacy. So attracting the support of civilians is a central concern in counterinsurgency. It's also, in some instances, a concern for rebel groups. But as you may be aware, part of the devastation that is wrought by civil war is actually how rebel groups treat civilians. And there's great variation in how rebel groups treat civilians. What do you think might explain that variation? Some groups treat civilians remarkably well. Some groups terrorize civilians, like the Revolutionary United Front in Sierra Leone was probably the most infamous of that group suffers out.
It's based on whether or not the population agrees or disagrees with their aims, right? Because they either are moving to position the population against the state and make it seem more costly for the state to continue its goal, right? In which case they'd be very hostile towards the population and try to get them to flare up. Or if the population is supporting them already, right? There's no reason to.
So in some instances that can definitely be true, but remember what we said before, that to get some people to join your group, they don't have to agree with you ideologically. They don't really even have to know what your ideology is. You might not even have to have an ideology. Yeah, Brandon?
Yeah, you just have to, treating civilians is all contingent upon, how much power that organization has to make the cost of not dealing with that organization high enough. So for example, the Basque region started attacking civilians in Spain,
Yep.
but because the civilians in the Basque region were not necessarily down with that form of violence, the terrorist organizations in the Basque region had to stop. Or other organizations take the other approach, which is we're just going to make this so miserable for you that you can't even say no to us or you should be dead. So it just really depends on how powerful that organization is.
So, okay, yeah, so these are good insights. I want to share with you the work of this guy, Jeremy Weinstein. I mentioned him before, who wrote Inside Rebellion, The Politics of Insurgent Violence. This is just an outstanding book. I would strongly recommend for anybody who's interested in this. He actually does a really great job creating this model that explains which groups are going to basically become ideologically motivated and have credible ideological motivation and treat civilians well, and which ones are going to terrorize civilians. And he says the key independent variable that explains this relationship is whether or not the group has access to easy money, especially from natural resources initially. There's a variant on this argument by Quinn and, no, it's McCoy. No, it is Quinn. It's Beardsley and Quinn, who wrote an article in the Journal of Conflict Resolution called Rebel Groups as Predatory Organizations. that say that the return on investment initially is what explains treatment of civilians. So Weinstein says that if you start with a lot of material capital, means that other people are funding your organization, so maybe you're getting aid from a superpower, or maybe you have lots of control over natural resource-rich areas. For example, the Revolutionary United Front in Sierra Leone had lots of access to precious gems and diamonds. So if you have these financing strategies, or say you have a diaspora, like the Liberation Tigers had, that funds you very, very well, you've got a ton of capital to start with, which means that you're starting to attract low-commitment, low-quality recruits who don't care what your ideology is, especially if they have a low opportunity cost of fighting. Because if you roll up into some place where there really isn't a lot going on in terms of upward mobility, and you have diamonds and AK-47s, and you just appear to be having a grand old time, people are going to join you, but they're going to be low commitment. They get promises of getting rich quick and getting to basically run roughshod over civilian populations, which just enough people have to find that to be an attractive proposition to get a really, really scary rebel group together. Now, just one thing. Rebel groups that don't start out with that material capital, they have to rely on building bonds of social solidarity. That's where it really matters whether or not the civilian population cares about your ideology, cares about what you have to say to the state. If you have the financing, you don't need the ideology, is the implication of Weinstein. Yeah?
Just like in debate terms when people talk about how, China will invest in a lot of countries and say oh, here's just money, it doesn't swing in different directions, this way you can come up with different dissents, and if you give rebel groups excess amounts of cash, this changes the direction they become more violent towards civilians, which could be a better linked story than just China will then be a proxy, have a proxy state or something.
Yeah, exactly. And it draws in the great powers, leads to nuclear war. Right. So, yeah, that's totally true. And I think that is part of the value of studying this in greater depth when we do have those debates about civil wars, which are becoming more and more common. The number of times you debated Syria last year, I lost count. And so if you don't treat insurgencies as just this monolithic group of freedom fighters, but rather understand them as highly factionalized with their own very logical, rational, and traceable sets of incentives, you can make far more interesting arguments about whether or not it's a good idea to support a state or a rebel group or get involved in a civil war at all. So one last, if you're interested particularly in the insurgencies that the United States has been dealing with, I would recommend a book by Admiral David Kilcullen called The Accidental Guerrilla, Fighting Small Wars in the Midst of a Big One. And his argument is that there's a really hardcore group of motivated fighters, often, and you're not really going to be able to deter them. You have to kill or imprison them. But then there's a big collection of people who he refers to as the accidental guerrillas. People who can be convinced not to fight if you go about counterinsurgency and CT appropriately. So he says most of the insurgents in Afghanistan and Iraq can be persuaded not to fight. But how is this class of fighters created? They're fence sitters. Why do they join, say, the Taliban? So think about it. If you are living in some rural area in Afghanistan and you see the Taliban and the United States are battling one another, and you could be persuaded to join either side if the cost is low enough or if the payoff is high enough, what can you do as somebody who is operating a counterinsurgency campaign to try to convince those people to join your side? Sorry? Give them incentives, sure. So like what?
Well, I was going to say foster animosity towards the other place
Right.
they could join.
Sure, but everybody's blowing everything up already, so there's plenty of animosity to go around. Yeah.
Smaller economic opportunities, so they don't have to go to the insurgent groups for that money. So if you're talking about an Afghan insurgent, a guy who had his farm just mostly blown up, try and give that guy a job before the insurgent comes around and be like, well, I know it blew it up, but here's a chance to make some money,
Yeah, so conceivably, definitely, yeah.
Stable protection for these people.
Good.
If
Sure.
the Taliban control an area or versus the United States, more people will be alive with one or the other.
Healthcare, food.
So
days that people need to live.
a strong state. Yeah. Sure. The other things that you can offer, opportunities for revenge. Because some folks who would be fence sitters, if given the opportunity, if they lost someone close to them in the fighting and they know who did it, if you arm them and give them the protection to do it, many will go on revenge killings. In fact, there was an outstanding book by that guy I mentioned way earlier, like an hour ago, Stavros Kalibas, called The Logic of Violence in Civil Wars. And his case study is the Greek Civil War. And he discusses at length just how many killings and how much Civil War violence is motivated by interpersonal disputes and small group disputes between families and neighbors, as opposed to big ideological cleavages. His argument is that all violence in civil war is local, which is a very interesting argument. Yeah.
How hardcore are the 10% really? I mean,
Exceedingly hardcore.
if they, such that even if they grew up with all their needs taken care of in a non-violent place, they would flock off, like, how,
Well, that would be the group that would be least likely to join an insurgency in the first place because their opportunity cost of fighting would be high. Does that make sense?
well, I'm wondering, like, what is the profile of one of these 10%? Are they just have violent personalities or something?
I definitely don't know anything about the psychological approaches to what makes somebody join an insurgent organization. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting work about it, but I don't know very much about their psychological makeups. But like we had talked about earlier, the people who have the low opportunity cost of fighting and can be ideologically motivated are the people that are most likely to join.
It's
Brandon?
also like a game of politics too, like, because if you look at Osama bin Laden, like, after a certain point, after certain statements that he made with the Saudi Arabian government, there was no turning back from, like, that, his involvement in that organization and what he meant to that organization. So I don't think it's necessarily possibly like a psychological thing that gets people taking, or like environmental, but there's also elements of politics, because like we said, this is an organization which could, in a lot of respects, be classified like to some smaller, weaker states to have that same kind of capability for people. So that's just me personally.
And a lot of times the background like that, like saying Osama bin Laden came from a very well-to-do background, he was very comfortable lifestyle and was very educated. And I feel like if they're more likely to give up that kind of background, they've abandoned everything for one goal.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. It's a credible signal of resolve to give up everything and start a terrorist organization. The one last thing about how this class of fighters can be created, or rather one last thought about the incentives, especially in the context of Iraq or Afghanistan. If you've announced as a counterinsurgency force that you're going to leave,
That's terrible.
doesn't that dramatically reduce the incentive to join you? Because if I join you and then you leave, not only are you not going to be protecting me, the Taliban are still going to be there, and they have pretty good ways of determining who fought with the United States and collaborated with the counterinsurgency group. So I guess maybe an implication to that is if you're going to draw down, don't do it when fighting is really intense, and maybe don't tell everybody. Until the fighting has, I guess, declined, fairly dramatically. All right. Any last thoughts, comments, questions before we go down to topic notes? So hopefully I have pitched you at least that this is very important material to debate about. And as more and more tournaments start seeking input from participants on what types of resolutions, I hope I'm making a case that resolutions that deal with international development are worthwhile. Thanks.